What happened to the nearly 1 million men who served in the Waffen SS after Nazi Germany's surrender? During World War II, the Waffen SS represented the armed wing of Heinrich Himmler's Schutzstaffel, growing from a small bodyguard unit into a massive military force of 38 divisions. These men fought on every front of the European war, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the beaches of Normandy. However, their reputation wasn't built solely on battlefield prowess. The Waffen SS became synonymous with war crimes, atrocities, and brutal enforcement of Nazi ideology. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, over 800,000 Waffen SS members suddenly found themselves prisoners of war, facing an uncertain fate. What came next was a complex web of trials, executions, imprisonments, escapes, and attempts to rebuild shattered lives. In this video, we will explore the diverse fates of these men and reveal the surprising truths about what happened to the Waffen SS after World War II. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, Waffen SS units fought with desperate ferocity. They had more reason to fear capture than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. The Allied forces, particularly the Soviets, had declared that SS membership alone constituted a war crime. The distinctive blood group tattoo on the inner left arm of most SS members made concealment nearly impossible. This small mark, designed to ensure rapid blood transfusions in combat, became a death sentence for thousands of men trying to blend in with regular German prisoners. In the chaotic final weeks of the war, SS soldiers faced a stark choice: surrender to the Western Allies and face trial, surrender to the Soviets and face almost certain death, or attempt escape through increasingly desperate means. The highest-ranking Waffen SS officers faced the swiftest justice. At the Nuremberg trials, which began on November 20, 1945, the entire SS organization was declared a criminal entity. This declaration meant that anyone who had voluntarily joined the SS could potentially be prosecuted for war crimes. However, the reality proved far more nuanced than this blanket condemnation suggested. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg specifically focused on the SS leadership and those directly implicated in atrocities. The trials revealed the extent of SS involvement in the Holocaust, mass executions, and systematic brutality across occupied Europe. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich was perhaps the most famous Waffen SS commander to face Allied justice. Born Josef Dietrich on May 28, 1892, in Bavaria, he had served in World War I before becoming one of Adolf Hitler's earliest supporters. Dietrich commanded the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the premier Waffen SS division, and later led the 6th SS Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. His rough-hewn manner and personal bravery made him popular among his troops, but his record was stained by numerous atrocities. After the war, Dietrich was tried by an American military court for his role in the Normandy massacre, where 84 American prisoners of war were murdered by members of Kampfgruppe Piper during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. On July 16, 1946, Dietrich was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. However, his incarceration was relatively brief by the standards of Nazi war criminals. Released from Landsberg prison in 1955 after serving just 9 years, Dietrich lived quietly in Ludwigsburg until his death on April 21, 1966. He never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until his death that he was simply a soldier following orders. Unlike Dietrich, SS Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hauser took a different path after the war. Born on October 7, 1880, in Brandenburg, Hauser was a career military officer who had served in the Imperial German Army during World War I. He joined the Waffen SS in 1934 and became one of its principal architects, establishing the SS officer, training schools and transforming the organization into a formidable fighting force. Hauser commanded various SS corps during the war, including during the desperate defense against the Soviet advance. He lost an eye during the Battle of Kharkov in 1943, but continued commanding troops until Germany's surrender. After the war, Hauser was detained by American forces but was never prosecuted for war crimes. This surprised many observers, given his high rank and extensive service. Instead, Hauser became a vocal advocate for Waffen SS veterans, organizing their Veterans Association, HIAG, Mutual Help Association of former Waffen SS members, and publishing memoirs that portrayed the Waffen SS as an elite fighting force separate from the criminal activities of the concentration camp SS. He argued persistently that the Waffen SS were soldiers like any other, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Hauser died on December 21, 1972, having spent his final decades attempting to rehabilitate the Waffen SS's reputation. But what about the foreign volunteers who joined the Waffen SS? By 1945, nearly half of all Waffen SS personnel were non-Germans, recruited from occupied countries, Allied nations, and even prisoners of war who switched sides. These men faced particularly complex fates after Germany's defeat. The British Free Corps, a small unit of British and Commonwealth prisoners of war who had joined the SS, numbered fewer than 30 men at the war's end. These men faced charges of treason when they returned to British custody. John Amery, the son of a British cabinet minister who had actively recruited for the unit, was tried for high treason. His case was open and shut. On November 28, 1945, Amery pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey and was sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on December 19, 1945, at Wandsworth Prison, becoming one of the last people executed for treason in British history. However, most members of the British Free Corps received lighter sentences, ranging from a few years to life imprisonment, with many being released in the 1950s. The fate of French SS volunteers proved equally complex. The 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne consisted of French volunteers who fought fanatically in the defence of Berlin. Many of these men were die-hard fascists who saw themselves as defenders of European civilization against Bolshevism. When Berlin fell, surviving members of the Charlemagne Division faced the wrath of both the Soviets and their own countrymen. Those captured by the Soviets were typically executed on the spot or sent to the Gulag, where few survived. Those who surrendered to the Western Allies and were returned to France faced trial for collaboration. Many were executed after swift tribunals in the immediate post-war period, while others received lengthy prison sentences. However, as the Cold War intensified and France sought reconciliation, some of these sentences were quietly reduced. By the late 1950s, most surviving French SS veterans had been released from prison, though they remained social pariahs in their homeland. The largest contingent of foreign SS volunteers came from the Soviet Union itself. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, motivated by anti-communist ideology, ethnic nationalism, or simple survival instinct, had joined various SS formations. The most notable was the 15th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, also known as the 1st Latvian, and similar units from Estonia, Ukraine, and other occupied Soviet territories. When the war ended, these men faced the grimmest fate of all. Under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, all Soviet citizens found in the Western occupation zones were to be repatriated to the USSR. This policy led to one of the war's most tragic episodes, the forced repatriation of thousands of former SS volunteers to certain death. In May 1945, British forces in Austria forcibly handed over approximately 40,000 Cossacks and other Soviet nationals, including many Waffen SS members, to Soviet authorities. Most were executed immediately or sent to labor camps where they perished. The British and American officers who carried out these repatriations knew the fate awaiting these men, but followed their orders nonetheless, creating a moral stain that haunts the Allied victory to this day. However, not all foreign SS volunteers faced repatriation. The Baltic SS units presented a particularly thorny diplomatic problem. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, occupied by Germany in 1941, and reconquered by the Soviets in 1944-45. Many Western officials questioned whether men from these nations were truly Soviet citizens subject to forced repatriation. The British government eventually decided that Baltic SS veterans who could prove they had been residents of the independent Baltic states before 1940 would not be forcibly repatriated. This decision saved thousands of lives. Many Baltic SS veterans settled in Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia, where they formed tight-knit émigré communities. Their presence remained controversial for decades, with Soviet officials repeatedly demanding their extradition as war criminals. However, most Western governments refused, arguing that service in the Waffen SS alone did not constitute a war crime unless specific atrocities could be proven. The German members of the Waffen SS faced a complex denazification process. In the immediate aftermath of the war, all SS members were automatically arrested and held in internment camps. The Western Allies established elaborate categorization systems to determine the guilt and appropriate punishment for each individual. Former SS members were classified into 5 categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and persons exonerated. The classification process considered rank, length of service, voluntary versus conscripted membership, and evidence of participation in war crimes. This process was far from perfect. The sheer number of cases overwhelmed the denazification tribunals, leading to inconsistent verdicts and lengthy delays. By 1948, as the Cold War intensified and Western authorities sought to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark against communism, the denazification process was substantially wound down. Many former SS members who had been classified as lesser offenders or followers were released with minimal penalties, often just a fine or a brief period of probation. One of the most notorious Waffen SS war criminals to face justice was SS Sturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. Born on January 30, 1915, Peiper had been Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant before commanding the 1st SS Panzer Regiment during the Battle of the Bulge. It was troops under Peiper's command who committed the Normandy massacre. In 1946, Peiper and 72 other members of his battle group were tried by an American military court at Dachau. Peiper was sentenced to death by hanging. However, his sentence, like those of many others from the trial, was controversial. Questions arose about the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions, with allegations of torture and coercion. As the Cold War intensified and German rearmament became a Western priority, political pressure mounted to reconsider the sentences. Peiper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1951, and he was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956, having served just 10 years. After his release, Peiper worked for Porsche and later for Volkswagen, though he was forced to resign when his SS past became public knowledge. He moved to France in 1972, settling in the small village of Prowess in eastern France. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day, Peiper's house was firebombed by unknown assailants, likely communist resistance fighters who had learned of his identity. Peiper died in the blaze, his charred body found with a pistol in his hand, suggesting he had chosen to die fighting rather than surrender. The story of SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer offers another perspective on post-war justice. Meyer, born on December 23, 1910, commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed primarily of teenage volunteers from the Hitler Youth. During the Battle for Caen in Normandy, soldiers under Meyer's command murdered dozens of Canadian prisoners of war at the Ardennes Abbey. After the war, Meyer became the first German to be tried by a Canadian military court. The trial, held in Aurich, Germany, in December 1945, attracted significant attention. Meyer was found guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad. However, Canadian Major General Christopher Vokes, who had fought against Meyer in Normandy, recommended clemency, arguing that Meyer had not personally ordered the killings and that battlefield conditions had contributed to the atrocities. Meyer's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was held at Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick, Canada, where he became something of a model prisoner, teaching German to other inmates and writing his memoirs. In 1954, Meyer was transferred to a British military prison in Werl, Germany, and was released in September 1954. After his release, Meyer became active in HIAG, the Waffen SS Veterans Association, and published his memoirs, which portrayed the Hitlerjugend division as young idealists rather than war criminals. He died on December 23, 1961, his 50th birthday, having never expressed genuine remorse for the murders committed by his troops. But it wasn't just the officers who faced consequences. Thousands of ordinary Waffen SS soldiers also stood trial for specific atrocities. The Dachau trials, conducted by the American military between 1945 and 1948, prosecuted personnel from various concentration camps and Waffen SS units implicated in massacres. The Soviet Union conducted even more extensive trials, often with less regard for legal procedure. In the immediate post-war years, Soviet military tribunals in occupied Germany sentenced thousands of former SS members to death or lengthy imprisonment in the Gulag system. The Soviets made little distinction between concentration camp guards and Waffen SS combat soldiers, viewing all SS members as war criminals deserving of harsh punishment. Many of these men disappeared into the vast network of Soviet labor camps, where the brutal conditions ensured that few survived to see release. The British also conducted numerous trials of Waffen SS personnel. One notable case involved members of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, accused of murdering British prisoners at Le Paradis, France in May 1940. SS Obersturmführer Fritz Knöchlein had ordered his men to machine gun 97 British soldiers who had surrendered after a fierce battle. 2 soldiers miraculously survived the massacre by feigning death beneath the bodies of their comrades. After the war, these survivors identified Knöchlein, who was tried by a British military court in 1948, found guilty, and hanged in Hamburg on January 28, 1949. His execution was carried out by the famous British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, who hanged over 200 Nazi war criminals. The fate of Waffen SS medical personnel presented unique legal and ethical questions. SS doctors had been heavily involved in both combat medicine and horrific medical experiments in concentration camps. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, had held SS rank and conducted grotesque experiments on camp prisoners. However, Mengele successfully escaped to South America and evaded capture for the rest of his life, drowning in Brazil in 1979. Other SS doctors were not so fortunate. Dr. Waldemar Hoven, chief physician at Buchenwald concentration camp, was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and hanged on June 2, 1948. The trials revealed that Hoven had conducted lethal experiments on prisoners and had murdered inmates by injection. However, many Waffen SS medical personnel who had served only in combat roles were never prosecuted, their skills proving valuable in the desperate medical situation of post-war Germany. The youngest members of the Waffen SS faced particular dilemmas after the war. By 1945, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and similar units were filled with teenagers, some as young as 16, who had been indoctrinated in Nazi ideology from childhood. How should these boy soldiers be treated? Were they victims of manipulation or willing participants in atrocities? The Allied authorities struggled with this question. In general, young SS members who could not be directly linked to specific war crimes were interned briefly and then released, often after a period of re-education. However, those who had participated in atrocities, regardless of age, faced prosecution. The case of Heinz Barth illustrates this complexity. Born in 1920, Barth was only 24 when he participated in the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre in June 1944, where an SS unit murdered 642 French civilians. Barth escaped prosecution until 1983, when East German authorities finally tried him. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, dying in prison in 2007, one of the last surviving perpetrators of that atrocity. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the fate of imprisoned Waffen SS members became increasingly caught up in Cold War politics. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer faced pressure from veterans groups and conservative politicians to secure the release of convicted war criminals. The creation of the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new armed forces, in 1955 required recruiting experienced military officers, many of whom had served in the Waffen SS. This reality created political pressure to rehabilitate former SS members or at least minimize their culpability. The result was a gradual relaxation of denazification measures and the early release of many imprisoned SS veterans. By 1958, all but a handful of the most notorious war criminals had been released from Allied prisons. This clemency remains controversial to this day, with critics arguing that it represented an abandonment of justice in favor of Cold War expediency. The question of Waffen SS pensions created another post-war controversy that persists even today. In the 1950s, West Germany established a pension system for Wehrmacht veterans. The question arose, should Waffen SS veterans receive the same benefits? Initially, the answer was no. The Allied declaration that the SS was a criminal organization meant that SS service could not be counted toward military pensions. However, this created a practical problem. Many Waffen SS veterans were in desperate financial straits, and their lobbying, combined with Cold War politics, eventually led to a change in policy. In 1961, the West German government ruled that Waffen SS veterans could receive military pensions unless they had personally been convicted of war crimes. This decision outraged Holocaust survivors and their advocates, who saw it as rewarding men who had served in a fundamentally criminal organization. The pension payments continue to this day, with the German government still paying benefits to elderly former Waffen SS members in their 90s and even a few centenarians. Some Waffen SS veterans managed to build surprisingly successful post-war careers, their pasts either hidden or overlooked in the chaos of reconstruction. Wilhelm Mohnke, who had commanded Hitler's bodyguard in the final defense of the Führer bunker, was captured by the Soviets and held in various prison camps until 1955. After his release, he returned to West Germany and established a successful freight forwarding business in Hamburg. Despite credible allegations that he had ordered the murder of British and Canadian prisoners during the war, Mohnke was never prosecuted. He lived quietly in Hamburg until his death in 2001 at the age of 90, maintaining his silence about his wartime activities to the end. When reporters occasionally sought him out for interviews, Mohnke would claim he remembered nothing or would simply refuse to speak. The international hunt for escaped SS war criminals became one of the defining features of post-war justice efforts. The most famous case was that of Adolf Eichmann, though he was not technically a Waffen SS member but rather worked for the Reich Security Main Office. However, numerous Waffen SS officers also fled Europe with the help of rat lines, escape routes that smuggled Nazi fugitives to South America, the Middle East, and other destinations. Organizations like Odessa, whether real or mythologized, facilitated these escapes. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, who had served in both the SD and held SS rank, escaped to Bolivia with American intelligence assistance, his anti-communist credentials outweighing his criminal past in the eyes of Cold War strategists. He lived undisturbed in South America for decades before being extradited to France in 1983, where he was finally convicted and imprisoned. Other Waffen SS fugitives were never caught. Aribert Heim, an SS doctor accused of conducting horrific experiments at Mauthausen concentration camp, disappeared in 1962 while facing investigation. Despite international manhunts and alleged sightings in Egypt and South America, Heim was never apprehended, though evidence emerged years later suggesting he had died in Cairo in 1992. The failure to capture such fugitives represented a significant gap in the post-war justice process, allowing war criminals to live out their lives in freedom while their victims and survivors sought in vain for accountability. The Eastern European Waffen SS volunteers who survived the war faced particularly tragic circumstances. The 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Galicia, composed primarily of Ukrainian volunteers, provides a harrowing example. Formed in 1943, the division fought primarily against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. When Germany collapsed, the division's survivors faced an impossible choice. Returning to Soviet-controlled Ukraine meant certain death or deportation to the Gulag. Many members chose to surrender to British forces in Austria, hoping for better treatment from the Western Allies. The British initially interned these men in camps in Italy and later in Britain itself. Their fate became a political football in the emerging Cold War. Soviet authorities demanded their extradition, classifying them as traitors and war criminals. However, British officials eventually determined that most had been Polish citizens before the war, not Soviet citizens, and therefore were not subject to forced repatriation under the Yalta Agreement. By 1947, the majority of surviving Galicia Division members had been released and allowed to settle in Britain, Canada, Australia, and other Western nations. This decision sparked decades of controversy, with Soviet and later Ukrainian sources accusing the West of harboring fascist war criminals, while the veterans themselves maintained they had been anti-communist freedom fighters rather than Nazi collaborators. The story of Leon de Grelle represents one of the most dramatic escapes of any Waffen SS commander. Born in Belgium in 1906, de Grelle had been a fascist politician before the war and became the commander of the 28th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Wallonian, composed of French-speaking Belgian volunteers. A charismatic leader and decorated soldier, de Grelle received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves for his battlefield exploits on the Eastern Front. As Germany collapsed in May 1945, de Grelle commandeered a Heinkel He-111 aircraft in Norway and flew towards Spain, hoping to find sanctuary under Franco's fascist regime. The plane ran out of fuel and crash-landed on a beach in San Sebastian, Spain on May 8, 1945, the very day Germany surrendered. De Grelle was seriously injured but survived. Spanish authorities, facing Allied pressure to extradite him, instead allowed him to remain in Spain, where he lived openly until his death in 1994. Belgium tried him in absentia and sentenced him to death, but Spain refused extradition requests. De Grelle became an unrepentant neo-Nazi propagandist, writing memoirs that glorified the Waffen SS and denying the Holocaust. His freedom and comfortable life in Spain remained a source of outrage for his victims and their families, a vivid example of how some high-ranking SS officers escaped justice entirely. The Danish and Norwegian SS volunteers faced unique post-war situations in their home countries. The 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland included volunteers from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and other Scandinavian countries. When the war ended, these men returned home to face treason charges. In Denmark, the legal reckoning was swift and harsh. Approximately 46 Danes were executed for collaboration, including several who had served in the Waffen SS. Hundreds more received lengthy prison sentences. However, the Danish government distinguished between those who had merely served in German military units and those who had committed specific atrocities or engaged in active collaboration with the Nazi occupation authorities. By the mid-1950s, most imprisoned Danish SS veterans had been released, though they remained social outcasts. Norway's reckoning was even more severe. The Norwegian collaborationist government under Vidkun Quisling had actively recruited for the Waffen SS, and Norwegian SS veterans were viewed as traitors of the worst kind. Over 18,000 Norwegians were convicted of treason-related charges after the war, including hundreds of Waffen SS members. 25 were executed, and hundreds more received long prison terms. The Norwegian SS volunteers who survived imprisonment found themselves permanently marked by their wartime choices, struggling to find employment or acceptance in post-war society. The fate of the Scandinavian volunteers contrasted sharply with that of volunteers from neutral countries who had joined the Waffen SS. Swedes who had volunteered for the Waffen SS could not be prosecuted for treason since Sweden had been neutral during the war. However, they faced social ostracism upon returning home. Swedish law prohibited citizens from serving in foreign military forces without government permission, but the penalties were minor fines rather than imprisonment. Most Swedish SS veterans simply blended back into society, their service records known only to their immediate families and local communities. Some became active in far-right political movements in post-war Sweden, but most chose to keep their pasts hidden, aware that public disclosure would bring shame and possibly violence. The Swiss volunteers presented another complicated case. Although Switzerland was neutral, several hundred Swiss citizens had joined the Waffen SS, motivated by anti-communist ideology or adventure-seeking. When they attempted to return to Switzerland after the war, they were arrested and prosecuted for violating Swiss neutrality laws. However, the sentences were generally light, a few months to a few years in prison, and most were released by the late 1940s. The Swiss government was more concerned with maintaining the fiction of absolute neutrality than with severely punishing its wayward citizens. Some Swiss SS veterans later admitted they had been naive idealists who failed to understand the criminal nature of the organization they had joined, while others remained unrepentant National Socialists until their deaths. The question of collective guilt versus individual responsibility plagued post-war justice efforts. The declaration that the SS was a criminal organization implied that all its members bore some guilt for its crimes. However, this raised difficult questions. What about men who had been conscripted into the Waffen SS against their will? What about ethnic Germans from occupied territories who had faced the choice of joining the SS or being deported to labor camps? What about young men who had joined at 16 or 17, indoctrinated from childhood in Nazi ideology? The Allied authorities grappled with these questions, ultimately deciding that individual circumstances mattered. Men who could demonstrate they had been forcibly conscripted or who had joined before the worst atrocities became known were treated more leniently than volunteers who had joined late in the war, when the SS's criminal nature was obvious. However, the application of these principles was inconsistent, varying widely between different Allied zones and different tribunals. The role of Waffen SS veterans in the formation of West Germany's new military forces became one of the most controversial aspects of post-war reconstruction. When the Bundeswehr was created in 1955 as West Germany's contribution to NATO, the question arose of who should lead this new army. The Western Allies had banned former SS members from military service, but this policy proved impossible to maintain. The reality was that many of Germany's most experienced military officers had served in the Waffen SS. The prohibition was quietly relaxed, and by the late 1950s, approximately 12,000 former Waffen SS members were serving in the Bundeswehr. This included some officers who rose to relatively high ranks in the new army. Critics argued that this allowed unrepentant Nazis to regain positions of authority and compromised the Bundeswehr's democratic credentials. Defenders countered that these men were professional soldiers whose expertise was needed for West German defense, and that excluding them would have made it impossible to build an effective military force. The debate continued for decades, with periodic scandals erupting when particularly notorious former SS officers were discovered serving in the Bundeswehr. The West German veterans organization, SHIAG, played a significant role in rehabilitating the Waffen SS's image in the 1950s and 1960s. Founded in 1951, HIAG provided social services and legal assistance to former SS members, while actively working to portray the Waffen SS as an elite military formation separate from the criminal activities of the concentration camp SS. HIAG published magazines, organized reunions, and lobbied the government for recognition of Waffen SS service. At its peak in the 1960s, HIAG claimed over 40,000 members. The organization promoted a narrative of the Waffen SS as soldiers like any other, emphasizing their military accomplishments while minimizing or denying their involvement in atrocities. This narrative found some acceptance in Cold War West Germany, where anti-communism and the desire to move past the Nazi era created space for such revisionism. However, HIAG's activities also drew fierce criticism from Holocaust survivors, historians, and left-wing political groups who saw the organization as an attempt to whitewash the SS's crimes. HIAG was finally dissolved in 1992, though smaller successor organizations continue to exist today. The treatment of Waffen SS veterans in East Germany differed dramatically from that in the West. The Communist German Democratic Republic took a hard line against all former Nazis, including SS members. East German authorities conducted extensive investigations and trials of SS veterans well into the 1980s. Former Waffen SS members found in East Germany faced severe penalties, including lengthy prison sentences, confiscation of property, and permanent exclusion from professional life. The East German government made no distinction between concentration camp guards and Waffen SS combat soldiers, viewing all SS members as war criminals deserving of punishment. This harsh approach served the communist regime's ideological purposes, allowing it to portray itself as the true anti-fascist German state while painting West Germany as a haven for unreconstructed Nazis. However, the East German approach also had a cynical element. Many former SS members who agreed to work as informants for the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, received clemency or reduced sentences, their past crimes forgiven in exchange for service to the communist state. The post-war trials of Waffen SS members revealed the complex web of crimes committed by the organization. While some units had primarily engaged in conventional military operations, others had been directly involved in anti-partisan warfare, which often meant the massacre of civilians. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, despite its elite status as a frontline combat formation, was implicated in numerous atrocities. During the invasion of Poland in 1939, members of the division murdered 50 Jewish civilians in the town of Błony. In 1940, British prisoners were killed at Wormhout, France. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, the division participated in mass executions of Soviet commissars and Jewish civilians. In Italy in 1943, the division murdered Italian officers and soldiers after the Italian surrender. At the Malmedy massacre in 1944, soldiers from the division killed American prisoners. This pattern of atrocities alongside conventional combat operations was typical of many Waffen SS divisions, making it impossible to separate the organization's military role from its criminal activities. The trials that addressed these crimes varied widely in their thoroughness and fairness. The Nuremberg military tribunals, which followed the main international military tribunal, included the Einsatzgruppen trial and other proceedings that dealt with SS crimes. These trials were generally fair by the standards of the time, with defendants receiving legal representation and the opportunity to present evidence. However, the trials conducted by Soviet military tribunals were often perfunctory, with predetermined guilty verdicts and harsh sentences. Western tribunals fell somewhere in between, generally following legal procedures but sometimes influenced by political considerations and time pressures. The result was an uneven pattern of justice, with some perpetrators receiving severe punishment while others escaped with minimal consequences. SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner represents an interesting case of a Waffen SS general who largely escaped accountability. Born on May 23, 1896, Steiner was a career military officer who had served in World War I. He joined the SS in 1935 and became one of the principal architects of Waffen SS tactical doctrine, emphasizing aggressive combined arms operations. Steiner commanded various SS formations during the war, including the Viking Division, which was composed largely of foreign volunteers. In the final days of the war, Hitler ordered Steiner to launch a counterattack to relieve Berlin, an impossible mission given the forces available. Steiner ignored the order, recognizing it as fantasy. After the war, Steiner was detained by British forces but was never prosecuted for war crimes. This was surprising given his high rank and long service. Instead, Steiner became a military consultant and author, publishing several books on Waffen SS tactics and operations. His writings portrayed the Waffen SS as an elite military formation and largely ignored the organization's criminal activities. Steiner died on May 12, 1966, having spent 2 decades rehabilitating his own reputation and that of the Waffen SS generally. The case of Otto Skorzeny illustrates how some Waffen SS members parlayed their skills into post-war careers. Born on June 12, 1908 in Vienna, Skorzeny gained fame in September 1943 when he led the daring rescue of Benito Mussolini from imprisonment at Gran Sasso. This operation, carried out with gliders and special forces, made Skorzeny a celebrity in Nazi Germany. He subsequently commanded various special operations and ended the war with the rank of SS Obersturmbannführer. After the war, Skorzeny was tried by an American military tribunal for allegedly violating the laws of war during the Battle of the Bulge, when German commandos in American uniforms infiltrated Allied lines. Skorzeny was acquitted, with the tribunal accepting his argument that the operation was a legitimate ruse de guerre. However, he remained in detention due to ongoing denazification proceedings. In 1948, Skorzeny escaped from an internment camp with help from former SS comrades and fled to Spain. He settled in Madrid under Franco's protection and established himself as an arms dealer and military consultant, working for various governments including Egypt and Argentina. Skorzeny allegedly helped establish escape networks for other SS fugitives and remained a committed National Socialist until his death from cancer in Madrid on July 5, 1975. His escape and comfortable post-war life demonstrated how some SS members successfully evaded justice through a combination of connections, skills, and political protection. The fate of the concentration camp guards who had been formerly part of the Waffen SS differed from that of frontline combat troops. The guard units at concentration camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau were technically part of the SS Totenkopfverbände, but many guards were transferred between the Totenkopf divisions and Waffen SS combat units. This overlap complicated post-war justice. The Allied authorities eventually decided to focus on individual actions rather than organizational affiliation. Guards who had participated in selections, mass killings, or torture faced trial and severe punishment, including execution. However, many lower-ranking guards who could not be directly linked to specific atrocities escaped prosecution, especially as the Cold War intensified and interest in pursuing Nazi war criminals waned. The Auschwitz trials conducted by West German courts in the 1960s brought renewed attention to SS crimes. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which ran from 1963 to 1965, prosecuted 22 former SS members who had served at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The trials received extensive media coverage and marked a turning point in West German society's confrontation with the Holocaust. Several defendants received life sentences, while others received shorter terms. However, the trials also revealed how many perpetrators had been living quiet lives in West Germany for nearly 2 decades, some holding respectable positions in business or government. The realization that thousands of SS war criminals remained unprosecuted prompted calls for more vigorous investigations, leading to the establishment of the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the investigation of National Socialist crimes in Ludwigsburg. The question of what constituted a war crime became central to many trials. Some Waffen SS veterans argued that they had been regular soldiers who had never participated in atrocities. However, prosecutors countered that service in an organization declared criminal at Nuremberg implied collective guilt for that organization's crimes. The courts generally rejected this argument, ruling that individual guilt must be proven. This meant that prosecutors needed to demonstrate either that a defendant had personally committed criminal acts or had been part of a unit that committed specific atrocities while the defendant was present. This evidentiary burden meant that many former Waffen SS members who had likely been present during atrocities but could not be directly linked to them escaped prosecution. The difficulty of gathering evidence decades after the events, combined with the death of witnesses and the destruction of documents, made successful prosecution increasingly difficult as time passed. The role of the Waffen SS in the Holocaust has been extensively documented through post-war trials and historical research. While the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads were separate from the Waffen SS, there was significant overlap in personnel and operations. Waffen SS divisions regularly worked with Einsatzgruppen in anti-partisan operations that involved the mass murder of Jews and suspected Soviet collaborators. The 1st SS Infantry Brigade and the 2nd SS Infantry Brigade were explicitly tasked with anti-partisan warfare in the occupied Soviet territories, which meant systematic killing of civilians. The Cavalry Brigade, later expanded to become the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, murdered tens of thousands of people in the Pripyat marshes in 1941. These operations were not incidental to the Waffen SS's military mission, but were a central part of the organization's role in implementing Nazi racial ideology. The post-war fate of these units' members varied widely. Some were tried and executed for their participation in mass murder. Others were imprisoned for varying lengths of time. Many were never prosecuted at all, their crimes lost in the chaos of war or deliberately concealed by their comrades. The difficulty of investigating these crimes was compounded by the fact that many occurred in remote areas with few surviving witnesses, and the perpetrators had strong incentives to maintain silence about their activities. The code of silence among former SS members proved remarkably durable, with many taking their secrets to their graves rather than betraying their comrades. The treatment of Waffen SS prisoners by the Soviets was particularly harsh and often indiscriminate. Soviet forces made little attempt to distinguish between SS members who had committed war crimes and those who had not. All captured SS men were viewed as war criminals deserving of death or lengthy imprisonment. In the immediate aftermath of the war, thousands of Waffen SS prisoners were executed, without trial, shot in the forests or fields where they had surrendered. Those who survived to reach prison camps faced brutal conditions, forced labor, and starvation rations. The NKVD and later the KGB conducted extensive interrogations of SS prisoners, seeking information about Nazi crimes and potential intelligence assets. Some SS prisoners agreed to work for Soviet intelligence, providing information about their former comrades in exchange for better treatment or eventual release. Most, however, remained in the Gulag system for a decade or more, with many dying from disease, malnutrition, or execution. The last significant group of German prisoners of war held by the Soviets was not released until 1955-1956, a full decade after the war's end. This group included a substantial number of former Waffen SS members who had survived years of imprisonment in Siberia and Central Asia. When these men finally returned to Germany, they found a country they barely recognized transformed by Reconstruction and the Cold War division. Many struggled to reintegrate into society, suffering from physical and psychological trauma. However, they also found a community of fellow veterans who had been working to rehabilitate the Waffen SS's reputation. Organizations like HIAG welcomed the returnees and provided assistance in finding housing and employment. The narrative these organizations promoted of the Waffen SS as soldiers who had fought bravely against communism resonated with Cold War anxieties and provided the returning veterans with a framework for making sense of their experiences. The Israeli pursuit of Nazi war criminals added another dimension to post-war justice. The establishment of Israel in 1948 created a state committed to ensuring that the Holocaust's perpetrators faced judgment. Israeli intelligence services, particularly the Mossad, actively hunted Nazi war criminals around the world. While the Eichmann case was the most famous, Israeli agents also tracked numerous Waffen SS members who had fled to South America and other destinations. However, the Israeli government generally focused on those with direct involvement in the Holocaust, rather than pursuing Waffen SS combat troops who had not participated in anti-Jewish operations. This selective focus reflected limited resources and the desire to concentrate on the most egregious criminals. The The Wiesenthal Center and other organizations dedicated to Holocaust remembrance also played crucial roles in identifying and pursuing Waffen SS war criminals. Simon Wiesenthal, himself a Holocaust survivor, dedicated his life to tracking Nazi criminals. His work led to the identification and prosecution of dozens of former SS members, including several who had fled to South America and assumed false identities. However, Wiesenthal also faced criticism for occasionally making unsubstantiated accusations and for his sometimes theatrical approach to Nazi hunting. Nevertheless, his work and that of similar organizations helped ensure that the search for justice continued long after official government efforts had waned. The social reintegration of Waffen SS veterans in West Germany was facilitated by several factors. The Cold War created a political environment where anti-communism trumped confrontation with the Nazi past. The economic miracle of the 1950s created jobs and opportunities that allowed former SS members to rebuild their lives. The decision to allow Waffen SS veterans to receive military pensions signaled official acceptance of their service as legitimate military duty rather than criminal activity. Conservative political parties, particularly the Christian Democrats, courted the veterans' vote and resisted efforts to thoroughly investigate Nazi-era crimes. The result was a society where former Waffen SS members could often live quiet, respectable lives, their pasts known perhaps to their immediate families but not publicly acknowledged. However, this comfortable reintegration began to fray in the late 1950s and early 1960s as a new generation came of age and began asking difficult questions about their parents' and grandparents' roles in the Nazi regime. The Eichmann trial in 1961, broadcast internationally, brought renewed attention to the Holocaust. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials further exposed the extent of SS crimes. Student protests in the late 1960s explicitly targeted what the protesters saw as an insufficiently denazified society, led by men who had been complicit in Nazi crimes. Former Waffen SS members found themselves facing renewed scrutiny and social condemnation, particularly if they had been vocal in HIAG or other veterans organizations. The experience of Waffen SS veterans in Austria differed somewhat from that in Germany. Austria had successfully portrayed itself as Hitler's first victim, rather than a willing participant in Nazi aggression, despite enthusiastic Austrian participation in the Nazi regime and the SS. This national mythology allowed Austrian SS veterans to reintegrate more easily than might otherwise have been the case. However, it also meant that Austria was slower than West Germany to confront its Nazi past. It was not until the 1980s, particularly following the Waldheim affair, that Austrian society began seriously grappling with the country's Nazi history and the role of Austrian SS members in the Holocaust and other crimes. The Waldheim affair highlighted the moral ambiguities that persisted decades after the war. Kurt Waldheim, who served as UN Secretary-General from 1972 to 1981 and was elected President of Austria in 1986, had his Wehrmacht service record questioned during his presidential campaign. While Waldheim had not been in the Waffen SS, revelations that he had served in a unit implicated in war crimes in the Balkans sparked international controversy. The affair demonstrated that European societies were still grappling with questions of individual responsibility for wartime actions and the extent to which service in criminal organizations constituted guilt. The generational shift in attitudes toward Waffen SS veterans became particularly apparent in reunified Germany after 1990. The fall of communism and German reunification prompted renewed examination of the Nazi past. The opening of Soviet archives provided new documentation of SS crimes on the Eastern Front. A new generation of historians, unburdened by personal memories of the war, produced detailed studies that demolished the myth of the Waffen SS as an apolitical military organization. These studies demonstrated extensive Waffen SS involvement in the Holocaust, anti-partisan operations that targeted civilians, and systematic violations of the laws of war. The aging Waffen SS veteran population found itself increasingly on the defensive. Public displays of Waffen SS symbols were banned in Germany and Austria. Veterans' reunions drew counter-protests from anti-fascist groups. Several European countries passed laws making it illegal to deny the Holocaust or glorify Nazi organizations. Former SS members who gave interviews often faced public condemnation, rather than the respectful hearing they had received decades earlier. The shift in public attitudes reflected both generational change and a broader European reckoning with the Nazi past. However, in some Eastern European countries, Waffen SS veterans who had fought against the Soviets were increasingly portrayed as national heroes rather than war criminals. In Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine, annual commemorations of Waffen SS units became flashpoints of controversy, with supporters viewing the SS volunteers as freedom fighters against Soviet occupation, while critics saw such commemorations as honouring Nazi collaborators. This reflected the complex legacy of World War II in Eastern Europe, where many people viewed both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as oppressors, and where service in the Waffen SS was sometimes seen as the lesser evil compared to Soviet rule. The question of how to remember the Waffen SS remains contentious. Museums and memorials dedicated to World War II grapple with how to present the Waffen SS's history. Should exhibits focus on the organization's military operations or its criminal activities? How should individual stories be told, as tales of young men caught up in historical forces beyond their control, or as choices made to serve a criminal regime? Different institutions have answered these questions differently, reflecting ongoing debates about historical responsibility and the nature of guilt. The personal testimonies of Waffen SS veterans reveal the range of attitudes these men carried into old age. Some expressed genuine remorse for their participation in a criminal organization, acknowledging that they had served an evil cause regardless of their personal actions. Others maintained that they had been professional soldiers who had fought honorably and bore no responsibility for crimes committed by other SS units. Still others remained unrepentant National Socialists, convinced that they had fought for a just cause and that history had been written by the victors. These divergent attitudes reflected not only individual personalities, but also the environments in which the veterans lived. Those who settled in countries that thoroughly confronted the Nazi past were more likely to express remorse, while those who lived in communities of fellow veterans or in countries where fascism retained some legitimacy were more likely to remain defiant. The children and grandchildren of Waffen SS veterans faced their own struggles with their family histories. Many grew up unaware of their father's or grandfather's service in the SS, the topic being taboo within the family. When they did learn the truth, reactions varied widely. Some felt shame and anger, others felt their relatives had been unfairly stigmatized, and many experienced complicated mixtures of both emotions. The difficulty of reconciling love for a family member with revulsion at their historical participation in atrocities created psychological burdens that persisted across generations. Some descendants became active in Holocaust education and reconciliation efforts, seeing this as a way to atone for their ancestors' crimes. Others distanced themselves entirely from the topic, changing their names or cutting ties with family members who remained too closely identified with the SS past. The legal persecution of Waffen SS war criminals continued sporadically into the 21st century. In 2013, a court in Munich charged SS Hauptscharführer Hans Lipschitz, who had served as a guard at Auschwitz, with complicity in the murder of thousands of prisoners. Lipschitz was 93 years old at the time of the charges. The case highlighted both the difficulty of prosecuting crimes 7 decades old and the determination of German authorities to pursue justice regardless of the time elapsed. However, the trial was halted in 2014 when Lipschitz was deemed too ill to stand trial. He died in 2016 without having been convicted. Similar cases involving other elderly former SS members demonstrated that the legal reckoning with Nazi crimes remained incomplete even in the 21st century. The most controversial ongoing issue involves the payment of pensions to Waffen SS veterans. Germany continues to pay military pensions to former Waffen SS members who were not convicted of war crimes. In 2017, it was reported that Germany was paying pensions to approximately 2,000 former Waffen SS members, including some living in other European countries. The annual cost was estimated at around $50 million. Critics argue that paying pensions to members of an organization declared criminal at Nuremberg is morally indefensible and sends the wrong message about Germany's relationship to its past. Defenders respond that the pensions are not rewards for SS service but fulfillment of legal obligations to pay military pensions, and that denying pensions to men who were not convicted of crimes would constitute punishment without trial. The controversy remains unresolved, with both sides presenting compelling arguments rooted in different understandings of justice and historical responsibility. the digital age has created new challenges in combating neo-Nazi glorification of the Waffen SS. Online forums and social media platforms host communities that idealize the Waffen SS, sharing romanticized images and narratives that downplay or ignore the organization's criminal activities. These online spaces attract young people drawn to the aesthetics and mythology of the Waffen SS without understanding or caring about the historical reality. Efforts to combat this online glorification have had limited success, as platforms struggle to balance free speech concerns with the need to prevent the spread of Nazi propaganda. The ease with which neo-Nazi groups can recruit and radicalize individuals online has created new urgency in educational efforts about the Waffen SS and the Holocaust. The Baltic states provide a particularly complex case study in how Waffen SS service is remembered. After regaining independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Latvia and Estonia faced difficult questions about how to commemorate their complicated World War II history. Both countries had been occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940, occupied by Nazi Germany from 1941 to 1944, and then reconquered and incorporated into the Soviet Union until 1991. Tens of thousands of Latvians and Estonians had served in Waffen SS units, primarily fighting against the Red Army. After independence, veterans of these units argued they had been freedom fighters resisting Soviet occupation rather than Nazi collaborators. Annual commemorations of the Latvian Legion and Estonian Legion drew both supporters who saw the SS veterans as national heroes and critics who viewed such events as honoring Nazi collaborators. The Russian government repeatedly condemned these commemorations, while European institutions expressed concern about the glorification of Nazi-affiliated formations. The controversy reflects unresolved tensions about how to interpret World War II in Eastern Europe, where the narrative of fighting against Soviet tyranny sometimes overshadows the criminal nature of the organizations through which that fight was conducted. The case of Waffen SS veterans from the former Yugoslavia illustrates another dimension of post-war justice. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prince Eugen, recruited primarily from ethnic Germans living in Yugoslavia, Croatia, and Romania, was responsible for numerous atrocities in anti-partisan warfare in the Balkans. After the war, members of this division who were captured by Yugoslav partisan forces faced swift and brutal justice. Thousands were executed without trial in the immediate post-war period. Others were sent to labor camps where they perished from mistreatment and harsh conditions. The Yugoslav communist government showed no mercy to SS members, viewing them as both war criminals and class enemies. Those who managed to escape to Austria or other Western countries and were later identified faced extradition requests from Yugoslavia, which most Western governments refused, citing concerns about the fairness of Yugoslav trials and the likelihood of harsh treatment. The story of the 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Handschar demonstrates the complexity of wartime allegiances and post-war fates. This division was composed primarily of Bosnian Muslims and was the first non-Germanic Waffen SS division. Recruited in 1943, the division was intended to fight partisan forces in Yugoslavia. However, the unit was plagued by indiscipline and mutinies, with many soldiers deserting to join the partisans instead. Those who remained with the division participated in anti-partisan operations that often involved atrocities against Serbian civilians. After the war, captured members of the Handschar division faced execution or imprisonment by the Yugoslav authorities. However, the post-war narrative in Yugoslavia largely suppressed discussion of Muslim collaboration with the Nazis, as Tito's multi-ethnic communist state sought to avoid inflaming ethnic tensions. It was only decades later that historians began examining the Handschar division's history in detail, revealing both the circumstances that led to its formation and the crimes it committed. The Indian volunteers who served in the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, also known as the Indian Legion or the Azad Hind Legion, faced unique circumstances after the war. These men, primarily recruited from Indian prisoners of war captured in North Africa, had joined the SS hoping to contribute to India's independence from British rule. After the war, those who were captured by British forces faced charges of treason and desertion. However, recognizing the political sensitivity of prosecuting Indian nationals for fighting against British rule, the British government handled these cases quietly. Most of the Indian SS volunteers received relatively light sentences and were released within a few years. When they returned to India after independence in 1947, they received mixed receptions. Some were celebrated as freedom fighters who had been willing to ally with anyone to achieve Indian independence, while others were condemned as collaborators with a genocidal regime. The controversy over their service continued for decades, with different Indian political factions interpreting their actions through different ideological lenses. The question of whether Waffen SS service constituted war crimes continued to generate legal controversies long after the war. In Canada, the issue arose in the context of immigration policy. After the war, Canada accepted thousands of European refugees and displaced persons, including some former Waffen SS members who concealed their service or claimed they had been forcibly conscripted. In the 1980s and 1990s, revelations that some of these immigrants had been voluntary SS members who had participated in atrocities sparked calls for investigation and denaturalization proceedings. The Canadian government established the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals in 1985 to investigate the presence of Nazi war criminals in Canada. The Commission found that hundreds of individuals with questionable wartime records had entered Canada, including former Waffen SS members. However, proving specific war crimes decades after the fact proved extremely difficult. A few high-profile cases resulted in denaturalization and deportation, but most former SS members in Canada were never prosecuted, either dying before proceedings could be completed or benefiting from insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. Similar controversies erupted in the United States, where the Office of Special Investigations, established within the Department of Justice in 1979, worked to identify and denaturalize former Nazis who had entered the country illegally. Several former Waffen SS members were identified and faced deportation proceedings. The case of John Demjanjuk, though he was not technically in the Waffen SS but rather served as a guard at various concentration camps, illustrated the difficulties these cases presented. Demjanjuk was denaturalized, deported to Israel where he was tried and convicted as Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, only to have his conviction overturned when evidence emerged that he may have been a guard at Sobibor instead. He was later deported to Germany, tried again, and convicted in 2011 of being an accessory to murder at Sobibor. He died in 2012 while his appeal was pending, meaning under German law his conviction was automatically invalidated. The case demonstrated the legal and evidentiary complexities involved in prosecuting concentration camp personnel decades after their crimes. Australia also grappled with the presence of former Waffen SS members among its post-war immigrant population. The Australian government's policy had been to exclude anyone who had served in the SS, but the chaotic conditions of post-war Europe and the limitations of background checks meant that some SS veterans slipped through. In the 1980s and 1990s, as documents from Soviet archives became available, several cases of former SS members living in Australia came to light. The Australian government investigated, but found that most of the individuals in question were too old or infirm to face trial, and that the evidence of specific war crimes was insufficient. The controversy highlighted the tension between the desire for justice and the practical difficulties of pursuing war crimes cases half a century after the events. The question of collective memory and how societies remember the Waffen SS continues to evolve. In Germany and Austria, the dominant narrative now firmly categorizes the Waffen SS as a criminal organization that participated in genocide and war crimes. Museums, memorials, and educational programs emphasize the SS's role in the Holocaust and other atrocities. This narrative serves important functions in modern German society, reinforcing democratic values and the commitment to never again. However, some historians worry that this exclusively negative portrayal may actually feed into neo-Nazi mythology by creating a sense of forbidden knowledge that attracts rebellious youth. They argue for a more nuanced approach that acknowledges the complexity of individual motivations while never losing sight of the organization's fundamentally criminal nature. The financial reparations paid by Germany to Holocaust survivors and their descendants stands in stark contrast to the pensions paid to Waffen SS veterans. Since 1952, Germany has paid over $90 billion in reparations to Holocaust victims and their heirs. This represents an acknowledgement of German responsibility for the Holocaust and a material attempt at restitution, however inadequate it may be to address the scale of the crimes. The fact that Germany simultaneously pays reparations to victims and pensions to some perpetrators creates a moral tension that critics argue undermines the message of the reparations program. Defenders of the pension system argue that the two programs serve different purposes and that denying legally entitled pensions would be arbitrary punishment. The survivors of the Waffen SS divisions that fought on the Eastern Front carried unique psychological burdens. These men had witnessed and participated in warfare of unprecedented brutality. The racial ideology that permeated the Waffen SS meant that the Eastern Front was not merely a military campaign, but an ideological crusade of annihilation. Waffen SS units routinely executed Soviet commissars, murdered Jewish civilians, and participated in anti-partisan operations that made no distinction between combatants and civilians. The psychological impact of these experiences varied among individuals. Some veterans were haunted by nightmares and guilt, while others managed to compartmentalize their wartime actions and build apparently normal post-war lives. The reluctance of many veterans to speak about their experiences made it difficult for psychologists and historians to understand the long-term psychological effects of participation in genocidal violence. The case of SS Hauptsturmführer Erich Priebke demonstrates how some Waffen-SS war criminals evaded justice for decades before finally facing trial. Born on July 29, 1913, in Hennigsdorf, Germany, Priebke joined the SS in 1936 and served in the SD, the SS Intelligence Service. During the war, he was stationed in Rome, where he participated in the Ardeatine massacre on March 24, 1944. In this atrocity, 335 Italian civilians were murdered in reprisal for a partisan attack that had killed 33 German soldiers. After the war, Priebke escaped to Argentina with help from a Vatican rat line. He lived openly in Bariloche, running a delicatessen and becoming a pillar of the local German community. His comfortable life continued until 1994, when American television journalist Sam Donaldson interviewed Priebke about his wartime activities. The interview prompted international demands for his extradition. Argentina initially refused, but eventually relented under pressure. Priebke was extradited to Italy in 1995. His trial became a major media event, with the aging SS officer showing no remorse for the massacre. He was convicted in 1998 and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he served most of his sentence under house arrest due to his advanced age. Priebke died in 2013 at the age of 100, having lived in freedom for nearly 50 years after committing mass murder. The story of the Das Reich division provides insight into how elite Waffen SS formations combined military effectiveness with horrific war crimes. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, was one of the most formidable German military units of the war, with a reputation for aggressive attacks and stubborn defense. However, the division was also responsible for numerous atrocities. On June 10, 1944, as the division moved toward Normandy to counter the Allied invasion, elements of Das Reich massacred 642 civilians in the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane. The victims, including hundreds of women and children, were herded into buildings that were then set on fire. Those who tried to escape were machine-gunned. This massacre occurred not in the heat of combat, but as a deliberate act of terror. After the war, several members of Das Reich who had participated in the Oradour massacre faced trial. In 1953, a French military court in Bordeaux tried 65 men accused of involvement. 21 were convicted, including 14 who received death sentences. However, the sentences proved controversial when it emerged that many of the convicted men were Alsatians who had been forcibly conscripted into the Waffen SS. The French government, seeking to heal divisions between Alsace and the rest of France, granted amnesty to the Alsatian convicts in 1953. The German perpetrators received varying sentences, with some being released after only a few years. The lenient treatment of the Oradour perpetrators caused lasting bitterness among the survivors and their families. The fate of the Waffen SS divisions that fought in the West differed significantly from those who fought in the East. Units that primarily engaged in conventional combat against British and American forces and had not been extensively involved in anti-partisan warfare or mass killings generally received more lenient treatment from Western Allied authorities. This reflected both practical considerations and ideological ones. The Western Allies needed to rebuild West Germany as quickly as possible to create a bulwark against Soviet expansion. This meant they were less interested in pursuing every former SS member and more interested in distinguishing between hardcore war criminals and regular soldiers. The result was that many Waffen SS veterans who had fought in Normandy, the Ardennes, or other Western Front battles were released from POW camps relatively quickly, sometimes after just a few years of detention. The experience of SS Standartenführer Jochen Peiper, previously mentioned, illustrates the complex trajectory of a Waffen SS war criminal. After his release from prison in 1956, Peiper attempted to build a normal life but found himself repeatedly frustrated by his past. He worked for Porsche and then Volkswagen, but was forced to resign when his employment became public knowledge and generated protests. He published his memoirs and gave occasional interviews, always maintaining that he had been a soldier following orders. In the early 1970s, Peiper moved to the small French village of Prowess, hoping to live out his retirement in obscurity. He translated military histories and corresponded with military enthusiasts who admired his tactical skills. However, French communist newspapers eventually revealed his identity and past, including his involvement in the Malmedy massacre. Peiper began receiving death threats and his house was vandalized. On the night of July 14, 1976, France's Bastille Day, his house was firebombed. Peiper died in the flames and the perpetrators were never identified. Some suspected French resistance veterans, others pointed to communist militants. The attack demonstrated that even 3 decades after the war, some Waffen SS war criminals could not escape their past. The creation of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in 1977 marked a new phase in the pursuit of Nazi war criminals. Named after the famous Nazi hunter, the center coordinated efforts to identify, locate and prosecute surviving SS members who had committed atrocities. The center's work led to several high-profile cases, including the identification of Waffen SS members living under assumed identities in South America, North America and Australia. However, the center also faced criticism for occasionally publicizing cases based on incomplete evidence or for pursuing elderly men whose involvement in specific crimes could not be definitively proven. The ethical question of whether it was appropriate to prosecute men in their 80s and 90s for crimes committed half a century earlier divided public opinion, with supporters arguing that there should be no statute of limitations for mass murder and critics questioning the value of imprisoning elderly, often infirm men for crimes committed when they were young. The treatment of foreign Waffen SS volunteers from Western Europe contrasts with that of volunteers from Eastern Europe. The 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, which included volunteers from Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden and other countries, fought primarily on the Eastern Front. When the war ended, Scandinavian volunteers generally returned home to face trial, while Western European volunteers often remained in Germany or fled to South America. The Dutch volunteers faced particularly harsh treatment in the Netherlands, where collaboration with the Nazis was seen as an unforgivable betrayal. The Dutch government prosecuted thousands of collaborators, including many who had served in Waffen SS units. Dozens were executed, and hundreds received lengthy prison terms. However, by the late 1950s, most had been released, and the Dutch government granted clemency to many of the remaining prisoners as part of a broader effort to move past the war and focus on reconstruction and European integration. The Belgian Waffen SS volunteers from the Walloon and Flemish units faced different fates depending on which linguistic community they belonged to. Flemish volunteers were generally treated more harshly, as their service in the SS was seen as part of a broader Flemish nationalist movement that had collaborated enthusiastically with the Nazi occupation. Many Flemish SS veterans fled to Spain or South America after the war, forming émigré communities that maintained contact with far-right movements in Belgium. Those who remained in Belgium and were captured faced trials that often resulted in death sentences or long prison terms. However, Belgium's complex linguistic politics meant that sentences were often commuted or prisoners released early, as different political factions used the collaboration issue to score points in ongoing Flemish-Walloon tensions. The Walloon volunteers faced similar legal proceedings, but Léon de Grelle's successful escape to Spain and his continued propaganda activities from exile made the Walloon collaboration issue particularly charged. The Soviet Union's treatment of its own citizens who had served in Waffen SS units was arguably the harshest of any Allied power. The Soviets viewed service in German military or SS formations as treason deserving of the most severe punishment. The First Russian National Army, also known as the Kaminsky Brigade, and similar formations composed of Soviet citizens who had fought for Germany, faced annihilation. Most members who were captured by Soviet forces were executed without trial. Even those who managed to surrender to Western Allied forces and were subsequently repatriated under the Yalta Agreement met the same fate. The scale of these executions was enormous, with tens of thousands of former Soviet citizens who had served in German forces being shot or hanged in the immediate post-war period. Those who received the mercy of labor camp sentences rarely survived the brutal conditions of the Gulag system. The Soviet government saw no distinction between those who had volunteered out of anti-communist conviction and those who had been coerced into service through hunger, threats to family members, or other forms of pressure. All were deemed traitors deserving of death. The question of how children should learn about the Waffen SS has generated ongoing educational controversies. In Germany, extensive education about the Holocaust and Nazi crimes is mandatory in schools, and the Waffen SS features prominently in these lessons as a key perpetrator of atrocities. German textbooks and curricula emphasize the organization's criminal nature and its central role in implementing the final solution and other genocidal policies. However, educators struggle with how to present this material in ways that are age-appropriate while still conveying the horror of what occurred. The challenge is particularly acute given that some students may have grandparents or great-grandparents who served in the Waffen SS. Educational approaches that seem to condemn entire generations risk alienating students, while approaches that emphasize individual circumstances risk minimizing the significance of choosing to serve in a criminal organization. The case of SS Brigadeführer Fritz Klingenberg illustrates another path taken by some Waffen SS officers after the war. Klingenberg, who had famously captured Belgrade with a small reconnaissance unit in 1941, survived the war and was detained by American forces. However, he was released after a relatively short period when no specific war crimes could be attributed to him. Klingenberg returned to civilian life and became a successful businessman. He avoided publicity and rarely spoke about his wartime service. He died in 1945 in a car accident, his death occurring so soon after the war's end that he never had to grapple with the long-term questions about his service that haunted so many other SS veterans. His case represents the many former Waffen SS members who simply disappeared into civilian life, neither pursuing rehabilitation of the SS's reputation nor facing prosecution for war crimes, instead choosing to leave the past behind as much as possible. The post-war fates of Waffen SS generals varied dramatically based on their specific actions, the circumstances of their capture, and pure chance. SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, who had been Himmler's chief of staff and later the supreme SS commander in Italy, successfully portrayed himself to American intelligence as a moderate who had helped negotiate the surrender of German forces in Italy. This allowed him to avoid prosecution at Nuremberg. He lived freely in West Germany until 1962, when renewed investigations into his role in organizing Holocaust transports led to his trial. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was released in 1969 due to ill health. He died in 1984, having spent the majority of his post-war life in freedom, despite his high rank and significant involvement in SS administration. His case demonstrated how some high-ranking SS officers successfully manipulated the chaos of the immediate post-war period to escape accountability. In contrast, SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, who had commanded the SS Cavalry Brigade during its murderous operations in the Pripyat marshes, did not survive to face Allied justice. Fegelein had married Eva Braun's sister and was Hitler's SS liaison officer in the final days of the war. On April 27, 1945, Hitler discovered that Fegelein had attempted to flee Berlin. Accused of desertion and possibly treason, Fegelein was executed by firing squad on Hitler's orders on April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's own suicide. Fegelein thus faced German, not Allied, justice for his attempt to abandon the sinking ship, though he was never held accountable for his participation in the mass murder of tens of thousands of Soviet Jews and other civilians. The Nuremberg trial's declaration that the SS was a criminal organization had far-reaching legal implications that continued to reverberate for decades. This declaration meant that in subsequent trials, prosecutors did not need to prove that the SS was criminal. This was already established fact. They only needed to prove that the defendant had been a member and had voluntarily joined. This simplified prosecution in many cases, but also raised questions about individual justice. Could someone be punished simply for organizational membership, or did criminal punishment require proof of individual criminal acts? Different courts in different jurisdictions answered this question differently, leading to inconsistent outcomes that frustrated both prosecutors and defendants. The story of the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord illustrates the fate of a Waffen SS formation that saw extensive combat but was not implicated in major atrocities. Nord Division fought primarily in the Arctic regions of Norway and Finland against Soviet forces. While the division participated in anti-partisan operations that likely involved war crimes, it was not associated with mass killings. On the scale of other SS divisions, after the war, members of Nord Division who were captured faced relatively brief internment periods. Most were released by the late 1940s and returned to civilian life. The division's veterans later organized reunions and published histories that emphasized their military service while minimizing any criminal activities. This ability to selectively remember the past was typical of many Waffen SS veterans associations, which focused on comradeship, military excellence, and anti-communist credentials, while avoiding discussion of the organization's role in genocide. The complex case of the 29th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, composed of Russian and Ukrainian personnel, demonstrates the tangled web of collaboration, coercion, and opportunism that characterized some Waffen SS units. Formed in 1944 from remnants of various Russian and Ukrainian volunteer units, the 29th Division never saw significant combat. Many of its members had joined German service to escape POW camps or forced labor. When Germany collapsed, these men faced a terrible choice: surrender to the Soviets and face certain death, or flee to the West and hope for mercy. Most who surrendered to or were captured by Soviet forces were executed or sent to the Gulag. Those who made it to Western Allied custody faced the forced repatriation provisions of the Yalta Agreement. The forced repatriation of these men, many of whom were shot within hours of being handed over to Soviet authorities, represents one of the darkest episodes of the immediate post-war period. British and American soldiers who participated in these forced repatriations reported being traumatized by the experience, knowing they were sending men to their deaths. The influence of Waffen SS veterans on post-war far-right movements varied across Europe. In some countries, former SS members became active in neo-Nazi parties and organizations, providing leadership, organizational skills, and ideological continuity with the Nazi past. In other countries, the stigma attached to SS service was so great that former members avoided political activity entirely. In West Germany, former SS members were legally barred from holding public office under denazification laws, though these restrictions were gradually relaxed. By the 1960s, it was possible to find former Waffen SS members active in conservative political parties, though they typically kept their SS pasts quiet. The revelation that a politician or public figure had served in the Waffen SS could end a career, as numerous scandals demonstrated. The Netherlands provides an interesting case study in the long-term social consequences of Waffen SS service. The approximately 25,000 Dutch citizens who joined various Waffen SS formations, particularly the 23rd SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nederland and the 34th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Landstorm Nederland, were viewed as traitors who had betrayed their country. After the war, Dutch collaborators faced a harsh reckoning. Over 150,000 people were investigated for collaboration, and about 14,000 were sentenced to prison terms. Several dozen, including some Waffen SS veterans, were executed. However, the large scale of collaboration meant that harsh punishment could not be applied to everyone without tearing society apart. By the 1950s, most imprisoned collaborators had been released, and the Dutch government encouraged a policy of forgiving and forgetting to promote national reconciliation. However, social stigma remained powerful. Former Dutch SS members often found themselves unable to find employment, shunned by their communities, and occasionally subjected to vigilante violence. Some emigrated to avoid this ostracism, while others simply endured it, living quiet lives on the margins of Dutch society. The Austrian experience differed from the German one in significant ways. Austria's post-war government successfully promoted the narrative that Austria had been Hitler's first victim, forcibly annexed in 1938. This allowed many Austrians, including former Waffen SS members, to avoid the level of scrutiny faced by their German counterparts. Austrians had actually been disproportionately represented in the SS, including in its most criminal elements. Austrians made up about 8% of the Third Reich's population, but constituted a much higher percentage of SS personnel and concentration camp staff. Notable Austrians in senior SS positions included Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who succeeded Reinhard Heydrich as head of the RSHA, and numerous concentration camp commandants. Despite this, Austria's victim narrative allowed many former SS members to reintegrate into society more easily than would have been possible in Germany. It was not until the 1980s, particularly after the Waldheim affair, that Austria began seriously confronting its role in Nazi crimes and the presence of former SS members in Austrian society. The question of whether the Waffen SS should be considered a military or a political organization sparked debates that continued for decades after the war. The Waffen SS itself promoted the idea that it was an elite military formation, distinct from the concentration camp guards of the SS Totenkopfverbände. This distinction had some basis in organizational reality. There were separate recruitment, training, and command structures. However, historians have demonstrated extensive overlap in personnel and ideology. Waffen SS units participated directly in genocidal operations, particularly on the Eastern Front. The organization's oath was to Hitler personally, not to Germany, and its members were indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology. The military skills displayed by some Waffen SS units cannot be separated from the criminal purposes those skills served. Modern historians generally reject the distinction the Waffen SS and its veterans attempted to draw between themselves and other SS elements, viewing the entire organization as fundamentally criminal. The fate of the youngest Waffen SS volunteers, those recruited in the final years of the war from the Hitler Youth, presented particularly difficult moral questions. Boys as young as 16 were recruited into the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and other units in 1944-1945. These teenagers had been subjected to Nazi indoctrination throughout their formative years. Growing up in a society that glorified military service and racial warfare, many went to their graves insisting they had been idealistic young men who loved their country, not criminals. However, the Hitlerjugend division was implicated in numerous war crimes, including the murder of Canadian prisoners in Normandy. How should society judge these boy soldiers? Were they victims of a system that exploited their youth and idealism, or were they responsible for their choices and actions? Allied authorities generally took age into account when prosecuting war crimes, with younger offenders receiving more lenient treatment. However, those directly implicated in atrocities faced prosecution regardless of age. The question of juvenile culpability for wartime actions remains a challenging ethical issue with no easy answers. The experience of Waffen SS veterans in the post-war decades reveals much about how societies deal with perpetrators of mass atrocities. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was widespread support for harsh punishment of all SS members. However, as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, several factors combined to reduce public support for continued prosecution. The onset of the Cold War made anti-communism more important than anti-fascism in Western policy. The practical challenges of rebuilding West Germany required mobilizing German technical and military expertise, much of which resided in men who had served the Nazi regime. The desire to move forward and rebuild created political pressure to draw a line under the past. The result was that by the late 1950s, the window for prosecuting SS war criminals had largely closed in the West, except for the most notorious cases. The Soviet Union continued prosecuting former SS members into the 1980s, but Western countries largely moved on, preferring to focus on Cold War concerns rather than continuing to pursue aging war criminals. The case of SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Ernst Remer illustrates how some Waffen SS veterans became active in post-war far-right politics. Remer had played a crucial role in suppressing the July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, arresting many of the conspirators. After the war, he was initially detained but was released after a short period when it was determined he had not committed war crimes. Remer became active in far-right politics in West Germany, founding the Socialist Reich Party, which was banned in 1952 for being anti-constitutional. He later fled to Egypt and then Spain to avoid prosecution for Holocaust denial. From exile, Remer remained a vocal neo-Nazi propagandist, maintaining an international network of far-right activists and denying the Holocaust until his death in 1997. His long career as a neo-Nazi activist demonstrated how some SS veterans remained committed to National Socialist ideology throughout their lives, using their wartime service as credentials within far-right movements. The gradual opening of archives in the former Soviet Union after the Cold War ended provided new documentation of Waffen SS crimes on the Eastern Front. Soviet military and intelligence files contained extensive records of interrogations, investigations, and trials of captured SS members. These documents revealed the scope of Waffen SS involvement in mass killings that had previously been poorly documented in Western sources. The new evidence prompted renewed investigations in several countries and contributed to a scholarly re-evaluation of the Waffen SS's history that demolished remaining myths about the organization being soldiers like any other. The archival revelations made it impossible for serious historians to maintain the fiction that the Waffen SS had been primarily a military organization separate from Nazi criminal policies. The memoirs and historical writings produced by Waffen SS veterans in the post-war decades created a problematic historical legacy. Many of these works were published by far-right presses and promoted revisionist narratives that minimized or denied SS crimes while glorifying military accomplishments. Books by authors like Paul Hauser, Felix Steiner, and Otto Weidinger found audiences among military history enthusiasts and Cold War anti-communists willing to overlook the SS's criminal nature in favor of studying its tactical innovations. These works influenced popular perceptions of the Waffen SS for decades, contributing to persistent myths about SS military excellence and political neutrality. Only with the emergence of a new generation of professional historians in the 1980s and 1990s, armed with better access to archives and less influenced by Cold War politics, did rigorous scholarship begin to dismantle these myths and establish a more accurate historical understanding of the Waffen SS. The international legal precedents established by the prosecution of Waffen SS war criminals influenced subsequent efforts to address mass atrocities. The principle that organizational membership in a criminal entity could constitute a criminal act, established at Nuremberg, became important in later tribunals dealing with genocide in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. However, later tribunals also grappled with the same questions that had complicated Waffen SS prosecutions. How should individual circumstances be weighed against organizational participation? What evidence is required to prove individual guilt beyond membership in a criminal organization? These questions remain central to international criminal law and demonstrate the lasting impact of the legal frameworks developed to address Nazi crimes. The physical remnants of the Waffen SS also presented challenges for post-war societies. Military equipment, uniforms, documents, and other artifacts raised questions about preservation, display, and interpretation. Some items were preserved in museums as historical evidence and educational tools. However, the trade in Nazi memorabilia, including Waffen SS artifacts, created concerns about glorification of the regime. SS uniforms, medals, and weapons became sought-after collectibles, fetching high prices at auctions and on online marketplaces. This commercial trade troubled many observers who saw it as profiting from genocide. Governments responded with varying regulations, from outright bans on displaying Nazi symbols to more permissive approaches that allowed collection for historical and educational purposes. The debate continues about where the line should be drawn between legitimate historical preservation and inappropriate glorification. The testimony of Waffen SS veterans in war crimes trials provided crucial evidence about SS operations and crimes. However, this testimony was often self-serving and unreliable. Veterans had strong incentives to minimize their own involvement and that of their units in atrocities. They portrayed themselves as professional soldiers who had fought honorably and attributed war crimes to other units or rogue individuals. Prosecutors had to carefully corroborate testimony with documentary evidence and statements from multiple witnesses. The unreliability of perpetrator testimony remains a challenge in prosecuting historical war crimes, as perpetrators rarely provide truthful accounts that would incriminate themselves or their comrades. The question of whether Waffen SS veterans should receive military honors remained controversial for decades. In West Germany, Veterans who had not been convicted of war crimes were legally entitled to wear their decorations, though doing so publicly was generally considered inappropriate and could provoke confrontations. Some Waffen SS veterans quietly wore their Iron Crosses and other medals at private veterans gatherings, but removed them in public. Others defiantly wore their decorations, viewing them as recognition of military valor that should not be tainted by the SS's criminal activities. The display of Waffen SS decorations became less common as the veteran generation aged and died, but occasional incidents of elderly men wearing SS medals at public events continued to generate controversy and condemnation. The role of the Catholic Church in facilitating the escape of Waffen SS war criminals through rat lines remains one of the most controversial aspects of post-war history. Vatican officials, motivated by anti-communism and sometimes by genuine humanitarian concern, provided documents and assistance that helped numerous SS members flee to South America. The most infamous rat line ran through Rome, where Croatian priests associated with the Ustasha regime helped German and Croatian SS fugitives obtain false identity papers and passage to Argentina, Bolivia, and other countries. The Vatican's involvement in these escape networks was not officially acknowledged for decades and remains a source of historical controversy. Defenders argue that individual priests acted on their own initiative rather than following official Vatican policy, while critics contend that senior church officials were aware of and tacitly approved these activities. The social dynamics within Waffen SS veterans' communities reflected the organization's hierarchical nature and unit loyalties. Veterans of elite divisions like the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf maintained a sense of superiority over veterans of later formed or foreign volunteer divisions. These hierarchies persisted in veterans' associations and informal networks. The old fighters who had joined the Waffen SS in the 1930s looked down on late-war recruits, while German volunteers considered themselves superior to foreign volunteers. These internal divisions occasionally created tensions within the broader SS veterans movement, but generally did not prevent cooperation in pursuing common goals, like pension rights and historical rehabilitation. The psychiatric evaluation of SS war criminals provided insights into the psychology of perpetrators. Examinations conducted during trials revealed no consistent profile of an SS war criminal. Some were sadists who had enjoyed their work, others were careerists who had committed atrocities to advance their careers, and still others were apparently normal individuals who had committed horrific acts when placed in certain situations and subjected to certain pressures. This diversity challenged simplistic notions that SS criminals were monsters fundamentally different from ordinary people. The disturbing implication that ordinary individuals could become mass murderers under certain conditions remains a crucial lesson from the Holocaust and the Waffen SS's crimes. The fate of Waffen SS members who defected or deserted during the war adds another layer of complexity to the post-war story. A small number of SS men had deserted to the Allies during the war, providing intelligence and sometimes testifying about SS crimes. After the war, these defectors faced complicated situations. Some were treated as valuable witnesses and informants, receiving protection and assistance. Others were viewed with suspicion. After all, they had once sworn oaths to Hitler and the SS. The defectors' motives varied. Some had genuine moral objections to Nazi crimes, others saw which way the wind was blowing and sought to save themselves, and some deserted for personal rather than political reasons. Determining which defectors were sincere and which were opportunistic proved challenging for Allied intelligence services. The few Waffen SS members who attempted to resist Nazi policies from within the organization faced tragic fates. SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Gerstein, who worked in the SS hygiene department, witnessed the gassing of Jews and attempted to inform the Allies about the Holocaust through contacts with neutral diplomats. After the war, Gerstein was detained by French authorities and found dead in his cell on July 25, 1945, in what was ruled a suicide, though some suspected murder. His attempts to expose the Holocaust from within the SS made him a controversial figure, with some viewing him as a hero and others questioning why he did not do more or resign his commission. Gerstein's case raised difficult questions about moral responsibility for those who remained in criminal organizations while claiming to oppose their activities. The gradual death of the Waffen SS veteran generation changed the nature of debates about the organization. As the men who had served in the SS aged and died, direct testimony became increasingly rare. By the early 21st century, very few Waffen SS veterans remained alive, and those who did were centenarians. The passing of the veteran generation shifted discussions from contemporary justice issues to historical memory and education. Without living witnesses, historians relied more heavily on documents, which meant that some aspects of the Waffen SS experience, particularly the psychological and social dimensions of service, became harder to understand. However, the end of the veteran generation also freed historical discussion from some of the distortions introduced by veterans seeking to justify their service or minimize their organization's crimes. The long-term impact of Waffen SS veterans on European politics and society extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. In the 1950s and 1960s, former SS members played significant roles in shaping Cold War politics, particularly in West Germany. Their anti-communist credentials made them valuable, allies to Western powers seeking to build a strong West German state as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. However, this rehabilitation came at a cost. The early release of war criminals and the integration of former SS members into positions of responsibility meant that denazification was incomplete. Former Nazis held positions in the judiciary, police forces, intelligence services, and government bureaucracy, where they sometimes protected their former comrades from prosecution or helped them evade justice. This incomplete reckoning with the past contributed to a broader failure to fully confront Nazi crimes that would have lasting consequences for German and European society. The role of Waffen SS veterans in intelligence services deserves particular attention. Both American and Soviet intelligence agencies recruited former SS members for their expertise in intelligence gathering, counterintelligence, and knowledge of opposing powers. The Gehlen organization, which became the foundation of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, employed numerous former SS officers. Reinhard Gehlen, though not himself an SS member, recruited heavily from SS intelligence veterans because of their anti-Soviet expertise. Similarly, the CIA employed former SS members in various capacities during the early Cold War. These employment decisions were justified on grounds of operational necessity, but created significant moral compromises. Intelligence agencies employing war criminals sent a message that expedience trumped justice and that useful criminals could escape accountability. Some of these recruited SS veterans used their intelligence positions to help other former SS members evade prosecution, creating networks that protected war criminals for decades. The story of SS Standartenführer Walter Rauff exemplifies this troubling pattern. Rauff had designed the mobile gas vans used to murder hundreds of thousands of people, primarily in the occupied Soviet Union. After the war, he was detained by American forces but escaped in 1946. Rauff fled to Syria and later to Ecuador and Chile. Despite being wanted for war crimes, Rauff lived openly in Chile and reportedly provided services to Chilean intelligence. Repeated attempts to extradite him failed, with Chilean authorities refusing to surrender him. Rauff died in Santiago on May 14, 1984, having never faced trial for his central role in developing the technology of mobile gassing. His comfortable life in Chile, like Priebke's in Argentina, demonstrated the limits of post-war justice and the willingness of some governments to harbour war criminals when it served their interests. The descendants of Waffen SS veterans have grappled with the burden of their family histories in various ways. Some have become vocal advocates for Holocaust education and reconciliation, viewing their family histories as cautionary tales and moral obligations. Others have attempted to distance themselves entirely from the past, sometimes changing their names or severing family connections. Still others have embraced revisionist narratives, defending their ancestors' service and promoting neo-Nazi ideologies. The transmission of historical memory within families and the ways different generations process and respond to Nazi-era family involvement remains an important area of study in understanding how societies deal with perpetrator legacies. The impact of Waffen SS service on veterans' physical and mental health varied widely. Some men returned from the war physically disabled by injuries sustained in combat. The German government's decision to provide disability pensions to wounded SS veterans, while denying pensions to those convicted of war crimes, created another layer of moral complexity. Should society provide medical care and support to men who fought for a criminal regime? The pragmatic answer was generally yes. Disabled veterans needed care regardless of whom they had fought for, but this created situations where taxpayers were supporting men who had committed or enabled atrocities. The psychological toll of SS service was rarely openly discussed. Many veterans suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though this diagnosis was not widely understood in the immediate post-war period. Nightmares, flashbacks, depression, and anxiety plagued some veterans, particularly those who had witnessed or participated in atrocities. However, the culture of silence that characterized many SS veterans' communities discouraged open discussion of psychological difficulties. Admitting to emotional trauma could be seen as weakness or, worse, as evidence of guilt about one's wartime actions. Some veterans self-medicated with alcohol, leading to substance abuse problems. Others maintained rigid psychological defenses, compartmentalizing their wartime experiences and refusing to confront them emotionally. The long-term psychological consequences of participating in genocidal violence remain poorly understood, partly because so many perpetrators refuse to honestly discuss their experiences. The question of religious reconciliation for Waffen SS veterans presented unique challenges for Christian churches. Many SS veterans had been raised in Christian households and returned to Christian practice after the war. How should churches respond to men who had committed or enabled mass murder? Different denominations and different clergy took varying approaches. Some emphasized forgiveness and redemption, offering pastoral care without requiring public acknowledgement of guilt. Others insisted that genuine repentance required confession of specific sins, which few veterans were willing to provide. The Catholic Church's involvement in ratlines that helped SS criminals escape justice complicated its moral authority to demand accountability. Protestant churches in Germany struggled with the fact that many church leaders had supported or accommodated the Nazi regime, making them poorly positioned to demand confession from SS veterans. The result was often an uneasy silence, with churches providing community and pastoral care to former SS members while avoiding confronting their pasts. The evolution of German historical memory regarding the Waffen SS reflects broader patterns in how Germany has dealt with its Nazi past. In the 1950s, the dominant narrative in West Germany was one of selective memory and minimization. Germans were portrayed primarily as victims of Allied bombing, of expulsion from Eastern territories, of division. The crimes of the SS and the Holocaust were acknowledged in the abstract but were not central to national identity. This began to change in the 1960s with the Eichmann trial and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which forced more direct confrontation with Nazi crimes. The 1970s and 1980s saw increasing public debate about the Nazi past, with younger Germans demanding accountability from their elders. The unification of Germany in 1990 prompted further examination, as the nation grappled with how to incorporate different historical narratives from East and West. By the 21st century, the dominant German narrative placed the Holocaust and Nazi crimes at the center of national memory, with museums, memorials, and educational programs emphasizing the importance of confronting rather than forgetting this history. The Waffen SS's transformation from an organization many Germans defended or minimized in the 1950s to one universally condemned in official discourse reflects this broader shift. However, this official narrative of confronting the past coexists with persistent undercurrents of revisionism and neo-Nazi activity. Far-right groups continue to valorize the Waffen SS, portraying its members as heroes who fought for Europe against Bolshevism. Online communities share Waffen SS imagery and promote revisionist histories. The fact that some Eastern European countries now commemorate Waffen SS units as national heroes complicates European efforts to maintain a unified historical narrative about World War II. These ongoing controversies demonstrate that the historical and moral questions raised by the Waffen SS remain unresolved in important respects. The comparison between how different Waffen SS members were treated based on when they were caught reveals much about the evolution of post-war justice. Those captured in 1945-1946 faced the harshest treatment, with many being executed or receiving long prison sentences. Those who successfully hid their identities or fled and were not discovered until the 1960s or later often faced less severe consequences, as Cold War politics had shifted priorities and evidence had become harder to gather. Those who escaped detection entirely and died before being identified faced no consequences at all. This temporal lottery meant that justice was highly uneven, with pure chance often determining whether a war criminal faced accountability. The role of investigative journalists in uncovering hidden Waffen SS war criminals cannot be overstated. Reporters like Bieter and Serge Klaasfeld devoted their lives to identifying former SS members living under assumed identities. Their work led to numerous prosecutions and extraditions. Simon Wiesenthal, though not a journalist, performed similar work through his documentation centre. These individuals and organisations filled gaps left by insufficient official investigation efforts. However, their work also generated controversy. Some accused Nazi hunters of conducting witch hunts, of pursuing elderly men based on insufficient evidence, or of being motivated by vengeance rather than justice. The Nazi hunters responded that there could be no statute of limitations for mass murder, and that age did not absolve criminals of responsibility for their actions. The final major trial of a Waffen SS member occurred in 2015-2016, 70 years after the war's end. Oskar Gröning, known as the accountant of Auschwitz, was tried in Germany for being an accessory to the murder of 300,000 people. Gröning had served as an SS guard at Auschwitz, where his duties included counting and cataloguing money taken from arriving prisoners. He was 93 years old at the time of his trial. Unlike many defendants in Nazi trials, Gröning admitted moral guilt and testified about what he had witnessed at Auschwitz, though he claimed he had not personally killed anyone. In July 2015, he was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The case sparked debate about the appropriateness of prosecuting a 93-year-old man for crimes committed as a young soldier. Gröning died in March 2018 while his appeal was pending, having never served his sentence. His trial was notable for his willingness to testify honestly about Auschwitz, providing valuable historical testimony even while defending his own limited role. The ongoing discovery of Waffen SS members through forensic genealogy and archived documents demonstrates that the historical reckoning with SS crimes continues. In recent years, researchers have used newly opened archives, particularly from the former Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, to identify SS members who had escaped prosecution. Some of these identifications led to renewed investigations, though the advanced age or death of suspects often prevented prosecution. The discoveries serve primarily historical rather than legal purposes, filling in the documentary record of who served in the SS and what they did. This research has helped demolish myths promoted by SS veterans associations and has provided more complete understanding of the organization's structure and operations. The educational legacy of the Waffen SS trials and the broader reckoning with SS crimes has been significant. The trials created extensive documentary records that have been invaluable for historians and educators. Testimony from trials, both from perpetrators and survivors, provides crucial evidence about how the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes were committed. The trials also established legal precedents that have influenced international criminal law and subsequent prosecutions of genocide and crimes against humanity. The principle that following orders is not a defense to charges of participating in atrocities, firmly established in the Waffen SS trials, remains central to international humanitarian law. The question of how museums and memorials should present the Waffen SS remains contentious. Should exhibits focus on the organization's military aspects or its criminal activities? Should individual soldiers' stories be told, risking humanizing perpetrators, or should the focus remain on victims? Different institutions have answered these questions differently. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. presents the SS, including the Waffen SS, primarily through the lens of its role in implementing the Holocaust. German museums tend to provide more context about the organization's structure and operations while firmly establishing its criminal nature. Military history museums sometimes face criticism for displaying SS artifacts without sufficient context about the organization's crimes. The debate reflects broader questions about how to educate about difficult history without either minimizing crimes or failing to provide adequate historical context for understanding. The transformation of sites associated with the Waffen SS into memorial and educational spaces has been uneven. Some SS training facilities and barracks have been preserved as museums or memorials. Others have been repurposed for civilian use with little acknowledgement of their history. Still others have been demolished, their history erased from the physical landscape. The decision about what to do with these sites reflects competing values: the desire to remember and learn from history, the wish to avoid glorifying Nazi institutions, and the practical need to use valuable real estate. Different communities have reached different conclusions based on their specific circumstances and values. The impact of Waffen SS crimes on survivors and their descendants creates a long shadow that extends to the present day. Jewish communities that were decimated by SS Einsatzgruppen and Waffen SS anti-partisan operations never recovered. Villages in the Soviet Union, Poland and Yugoslavia that were destroyed in SS operations remain ruins or were never rebuilt. Families were shattered, with survivors often losing everyone they knew. The psychological trauma of surviving SS atrocities has been transmitted across generations, with children and grandchildren of survivors experiencing secondary trauma. The inadequacy of post-war justice, the fact that so many perpetrators escaped punishment or received sentences that seemed absurdly light compared to their crimes, has been a source of lasting pain for survivors and their families. The international nature of the Waffen SS meant that its legacy affects numerous countries. Every European nation had citizens who joined the S, whether as volunteers, conscripts, or something in between. Each country has had to grapple with how to remember these men. Should they be viewed as traitors who collaborated with the enemy, or as misguided individuals caught up in historical forces beyond their control? Should their service be acknowledged as part of national history, or should it be forgotten? Different nations have answered these questions differently, reflecting their own particular historical experiences and political cultures. The academic study of the Waffen SS has evolved significantly over the decades. Early post-war histories often relied heavily on testimony from SS veterans and were influenced by Cold War politics that made anti-communist veterans seem sympathetic. These early histories tended to emphasize military operations while downplaying criminal activities. From the 1980s onward, historians gained better access to archives and were less influenced by Cold War considerations. The new generation of scholarship, represented by historians like Christopher Browning, Waitman Bjorn, and many others, has definitively established the Waffen SS's central role in the Holocaust and other atrocities. Modern historical consensus views the Waffen SS as a thoroughly criminal organization in which military and ideological functions were inseparable. The comparison between how perpetrators and victims were treated in the post-war period reveals troubling inequities. While SS veterans received pensions and integration assistance, Holocaust survivors often struggled to receive adequate compensation or support. The West German government was slow to acknowledge responsibility for the Holocaust and initially paid minimal reparations. Survivors faced bureaucratic obstacles in claiming compensation, often having to prove their suffering in ways that re-traumatized them. Meanwhile, SS veterans organized politically to secure their pension rights and used veterans associations to provide mutual support. The imbalance between support for perpetrators and victims remains a source of moral outrage for many observers and represents one of the failures of post-war justice. The geographical distribution of Waffen SS veterans after the war created distinct communities of former SS members in various locations. Argentina became home to thousands of German and Croatian SS fugitives who formed social networks that maintained Nazi ideology and mutual protection. The city of Bariloche in Argentine Patagonia became particularly notorious as a haven for Nazi criminals, including several high-ranking SS officers. These communities remained largely intact until the 1980s, when democratic governments in South America began cooperating more fully with European efforts to prosecute war criminals. Paraguay and Bolivia also harbored SS fugitives, with some receiving protection from authoritarian governments that valued their anti-communist credentials or military expertise. In the Middle East, Syria and Egypt employed former SS members as military advisors and intelligence consultants, valuing their experience fighting Soviet forces. These employment relationships allowed SS fugitives to live comfortably while evading European justice. The fate of Waffen SS combat medics and medical personnel highlighted the ethical complexities of post-war justice. Many SS medical personnel had provided legitimate battlefield medical care, while others had participated in criminal medical experiments or murder of patients deemed unfit. Distinguishing between these groups proved challenging. Some SS doctors who had only treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals returned to medical practice in post-war Germany after brief detention periods. Others who had been implicated in euthanasia programs or medical experiments faced prosecution. The case of SS Hauptsturmführer Aribert Heim, mentioned earlier, exemplifies the worst of SS medical crimes. Heim allegedly conducted deadly experiments on prisoners at Mauthausen concentration camp, killing inmates by injecting poison directly into their hearts. His escape and decades of freedom in Egypt represented a failure of post-war justice. The treatment of Waffen SS artillery and tank crews differed from that of infantry, who had been more directly involved in anti-partisan operations and mass shootings. Artillery personnel could more plausibly claim to have been regular soldiers engaged in conventional military operations. Unless specific war crimes could be attributed to their units, tank and artillery crews often received relatively lenient treatment. Many returned to civilian life and worked in technical fields, their military expertise in mechanics and engineering proving valuable in post-war reconstruction. Some later worked in the defense industries of West Germany and other NATO countries, designing and building weapon systems for the Cold War. The experience of Waffen SS musicians, clerks, and other support personnel demonstrated that not all SS members were directly involved in combat or atrocities. However, their service still supported an organization engaged in genocide. The question of moral culpability for support personnel who never personally committed violence remains philosophically challenging. Were they complicit in SS crimes through their support roles, or were they simply doing jobs that would have existed in any military organization? Different courts and different societies answered this question differently, with some holding all SS members equally culpable and others distinguishing between direct perpetrators and support personnel. The question of whether it is possible to forgive crimes of the magnitude committed by the Waffen SS has no simple answer. Some survivors and their descendants have found ways to forgive, seeing it as necessary for their own healing. Others insist that certain crimes are unforgivable and that forgiveness without genuine repentance would be meaningless. The fact that so few Waffen SS veterans expressed genuine remorse makes the question of forgiveness particularly difficult. How can one forgive someone who does not acknowledge wrongdoing? The theological and philosophical questions raised by SS crimes continue to challenge religious leaders, ethicists, and ordinary people, grappling with how to respond to atrocity. The reunification of Germany in 1990 brought new attention to Waffen SS crimes and the incomplete denazification of West Germany. When East German archives became accessible, researchers discovered evidence of former SS members who had built successful careers in West Germany, while their pasts were known to East German intelligence but had not been shared with Western authorities. The Stasi had compiled extensive files on former Nazis living in West Germany, which they used for propaganda purposes and occasionally for blackmail. After reunification, some of these files led to renewed investigations and prosecutions, though by the 1990s, most suspects were too elderly for trial. The role of Waffen SS veterans in establishing and staffing West German security forces raised persistent concerns about continuity between Nazi and post-war institutions. The Federal Border Guard, established in 1951, recruited heavily from former Wehrmacht and Waffen SS personnel who had experience in combat operations. Critics argued this created an organization culturally connected to Nazi militarism. The West German police forces also included many former SS members, particularly in positions dealing with surveillance of communist organizations, where their anti-communist credentials outweighed concerns about their Nazi pasts. This continuity created situations where victims of Nazi persecution sometimes found themselves dealing with officials who had served the regime that persecuted them. The transformation of former SS training facilities and headquarters into democratic institutions represented a symbolic effort to overcome the Nazi past. The SS officer school at Bad Tölz, which had trained thousands of Waffen SS officers, was converted into a US Army facility after the war, and later became a school for the German Federal Police. The former SS concentration camp administrative headquarters at Oranienburg became a memorial and museum. These transformations attempted to reclaim spaces associated with SS crimes for democratic purposes, though critics argued that some sites should have been demolished entirely rather than repurposed. The impact of Waffen SS service on veterans' family relationships varied widely. Some veterans' families knew nothing of their service in the SS, the secret maintained until death or discovery through historical research. Other families were aware but never discussed it, treating it as a shameful family secret. Some veterans openly discussed their service with their children, either boastfully or with expressions of regret. The secrecy and silence that characterized many families created psychological burdens for subsequent generations, who struggled to reconcile their family histories with moral principles. In some cases, children who learned of their parents' or grandparents' SS service experienced identity crises, questioning whether they could still love family members who had participated in atrocities. The artistic and literary responses to the Waffen SS's history have evolved over the decades. Early post-war German literature often portrayed German soldiers, including some SS members, as victims of circumstance caught up in historical forces beyond their control. This narrative began to change in the 1960s and 1970s as a new generation of writers directly confronted German guilt and responsibility. Günther Grass's novel *The Tin Drum* and other works challenged comfortable narratives of German victimhood. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, German literature increasingly centered Holocaust victims rather than perpetrators, reflecting a broader shift in how German society understood its past. The legacy of the Waffen SS in popular culture has been problematic. Films, video games, and novels sometimes portray SS members in ways that glamorize or romanticize them, focusing on their military prowess while minimizing their crimes. The distinctive SS uniforms, designed by Hugo Boss to be visually striking, continue to fascinate some people who are drawn to their aesthetic without understanding or caring about what they represented. This cultural fascination with SS imagery and mythology creates challenges for educators trying to ensure that the organization's history is understood in its full horror, rather than romanticized. The line between studying history and glorifying evil is sometimes difficult to maintain, particularly in commercial entertainment media. The impact of internet technology on preserving and disseminating information about Waffen SS crimes has been significant. Digitization of archives has made documents about SS operations and personnel accessible to researchers worldwide. Online databases allow investigators to search for specific individuals and units, making it harder for war criminals to hide. However, the internet has also facilitated neo-Nazi propaganda and glorification of the Waffen SS, with websites and forums promoting revisionist histories and recruiting new adherents to Nazi ideology. The challenge of combating online hate while preserving freedom of speech remains unresolved, with different countries taking different approaches to regulating online Nazi content. The philosophical question of how ordinary men became mass murderers remains central to understanding the Waffen SS. Were SS members fundamentally different from ordinary people, or could anyone have done what they did under similar circumstances? The answer appears to be disturbingly the latter. Studies of SS personnel reveal that most were not pathological sadists, but rather ordinary individuals who, placed in certain institutional contexts and subjected to certain ideological pressures, committed extraordinary crimes. This does not excuse their actions, but does raise profound questions about human nature and the conditions under which ordinary people can become perpetrators of atrocities. These questions remain relevant today as the world continues to witness genocide and mass atrocities. The economic reintegration of Waffen SS veterans proceeded relatively smoothly in West Germany, despite concerns about their pasts. The post-war labour shortage meant that skilled workers were in high demand, and many former SS members found employment in industries ranging from manufacturing to services. Some used technical skills learned in the SS, such as engineering or administration, to build successful careers. Others worked in manual labour or agriculture. The economic miracle of the 1950s created opportunities that allowed many veterans to rebuild their lives materially, even as questions about their moral and legal accountability remained unresolved. The role of memory and commemoration in shaping how the Waffen SS is remembered varies dramatically across Europe. In Germany and Austria, official commemoration focuses on victims of Nazism rather than German soldiers, including SS members. No monuments honour the Waffen SS in these countries, and public displays of SS symbols are illegal. However, in parts of Eastern Europe, particularly the Baltic states and Ukraine, some local communities have erected monuments to Waffen SS units that fought against the Soviet Union, viewing them as national heroes despite their service to Nazi Germany. These commemorations generate controversy and diplomatic tensions, with Russia and Jewish organizations condemning them as honoring Nazi collaborators, while local supporters defend them as honoring those who fought against Soviet occupation. The scientific and medical knowledge gained through SS medical experiments raises profound ethical questions. Some SS doctors conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners that caused immense suffering and death. After the war, debates arose about whether data from these criminal experiments should ever be used for scientific purposes. Most ethical guidelines now firmly prohibit using such data, arguing that doing so would compound the crimes by benefiting from them. However, a minority argued that refusing to use the data meant the victims suffered for nothing. The consensus has been that using data from criminal experiments would legitimize the methods used to obtain it and create incentives for future unethical research. As we reach the end of this comprehensive examination of what happened to the Waffen SS, after World War II, several themes emerge. First, justice was incomplete and uneven. Many perpetrators escape punishment entirely, while others receive sentences that seem inadequate given the magnitude of their crimes. Second, the Cold War significantly affected how SS veterans were treated, with anti-communism often trumping accountability. Third, the process of historical reckoning has been long and continues to this day, with each generation having to grapple anew with how to remember and learn from this history. Fourth, the moral questions raised by SS crimes about individual responsibility, collective guilt, forgiveness, and justice remain challenging and relevant. The nearly 1 million men who served in the Waffen SS met vastly different fates after Germany's surrender. Some were executed for their crimes, others served long prison sentences. Many were released after brief detention and successfully reintegrated into society, their pasts hidden or minimized. Fortunate. Few escaped prosecution entirely, living comfortable lives in freedom while their victims lay in unmarked graves. The diversity of outcomes reflects the chaos of the post-war period, the limitations of Allied justice systems, the influence of Cold War politics, and the inadequacy of any human system of justice to fully address crimes of such magnitude. The Waffen SS's history serves as a reminder of what can happen when military organizations are infused with genocidal ideology, when soldiers are taught that certain groups of people are subhuman and therefore legitimate targets for extermination. The post-war fate of SS members demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of accountability for mass atrocities. The fact that some SS war criminals lived full lives without facing justice is a sobering reminder that evil often goes unpunished. However, the fact that many did face trial, that their crimes were documented and condemned, and that their organization's criminal nature was established as historical fact represents a significant achievement of post-war justice. Today, with the last Waffen SS veterans having died or reached extreme old age, the organization has passed fully from lived experience into history. The debates continue about how to remember the SS, how to educate about its crimes, and what lessons to draw from its history. But the men who wore the SS runes on their collars and the blood group tattoos on their arms are nearly all gone. What remains is the documentary record of what they did, the testimony of those who survived their actions, and the obligation for each generation to grapple honestly with this history. The story of what happened to the Waffen SS after World War II is ultimately a story about justice, both its successes and its failures. It is a story about how societies deal with perpetrators of mass atrocities, how politics affects accountability, and how historical memory evolves over time. It is a reminder that the reckoning with great evil is never complete, that each generation must confront this history anew, and that the questions raised by the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes remain urgently relevant today. As we continue to witness atrocities around the world, the lessons learned from pursuing justice for Waffen SS crimes provide both inspiration and warning about the possibilities and limitations of holding perpetrators accountable. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. The story of what happened to the Waffen SS after World War II reveals the complexities of pursuing justice for mass atrocities and the challenges of historical memory. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video, What Happened to the Children of Nazi Leaders After World War II, which explores another dimension of how individuals dealt with the legacy of Nazi crimes. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.